The helmsman saw her first. It was the afternoon of December 4th, 1872, a Tuesday, and the brigantine Dei Gratia was making her way northeast through the Atlantic, approximately 600 miles west of Portugal, her crew engaged in the ordinary work of a transatlantic crossing, when the helmsman John Johnson noticed another vessel some distance off, moving in a way that was wrong. Not obviously wrong, not distressed in any dramatic or visible way, but wrong in the specific manner that only an experienced seaman would notice at that distance, the manner of a ship without purpose, without direction, without anyone at the helm shaping her course through the waves. Captain David Reed Morehouse trained his glass on the distant vessel and watched her for 2 hours. In that time, she drifted erratically, her sails partially set but poorly managed, her heading shifting without the steady correction that a hand on the wheel provides. She was not in distress in any conventional sense. No distress signals, no flares, no flags of any kind, no one visible on deck waving or calling for help. She was simply sailing without being sailed, moving through the water with the specific quality of a thing that has been abandoned. Morehouse knew the ship. She was the Mary Celeste, an American brigantine out of New York, and he knew her captain. Benjamin Briggs was a man he had dined with in New York not a month before, the last week of October, before either of their ships had departed for the Mediterranean. Morehouse had no reason to expect anything unusual, and yet here was Briggs' ship, sailing herself across the Atlantic, with no one at the wheel and no one visible anywhere on deck, on a calm afternoon in the open ocean. He ordered a boarding party. His first mate, Oliver DeVoe, and 2 sailors, John Wright and John Johnson, took a small boat across the water between the 2 ships and climbed aboard the Mary Celeste. What they found in the next hours, and what they did not find, is the substance of one of the most famous maritime mysteries in history, a case that has generated theories and arguments and investigations across 150 years without producing a definitive explanation for why 10 people left a seaworthy ship and were never seen again. DeVoe was a practical man, a professional mariner who approached the boarding with the systematic attention of someone assessing salvage. He went through the ship methodically, noting what was present and what was absent, what was in its proper place and what was not, what the physical state of the vessel told him about what had happened and when. His testimony at the Gibraltar hearing that followed, given under oath to the Queen's advocate, Solly Flood, is the primary evidentiary record of what was found on the Mary Celeste, and it is worth following in detail, because the details are where the mystery lives. The ship was in generally sound condition, not perfect, not as a well-crewed and actively managed vessel would be, but seaworthy. There was water between decks, enough to suggest that some had gotten in over a period of days, but not the flooding that would indicate serious damage to the hull. The rigging showed signs of disorder, some lines loose, some improperly set, some sails in better condition than others, but the standing rigging, the fixed ropes and stays that hold the masts in place, was intact and sound. The hull, below the waterline, showed no evidence of a strike or a grounding. She was a vessel that had been abandoned rather than damaged, empty rather than broken. The missing sails were notable. The foresail and the upper foretopsail were gone, lost in what appeared to have been heavy weather at some point during the voyage. Other sails were set but improperly, or furled but loosely, as though they had been left in whatever state they were in at the moment the crew departed, rather than carefully secured. The overall impression was of a ship that had been hastily vacated, not of one whose crew had taken the time to properly prepare her for a period without management. The ship's compass was disrupted. The binnacle, the housing that protects the compass, had been knocked over or displaced, and the compass itself was out of its proper orientation. In the subsequent hearing, this detail would attract attention, because a displaced compass on a ship underway is an unusual thing, suggesting either a sharp impact or a violent movement. There was a rope trailing from the stern of the ship, a long rope, one end attached to the ship, the other end free, dragging in the water behind. Deveau looked at the rope and drew an inference. It had been used to tow something, and whatever it had been towing had eventually pulled free or been released, leaving the rope behind. A lifeboat, perhaps, the kind of rope that might have been attached to a lifeboat as the crew abandoned ship, intending to hold the boat close or to make their way back to the ship later. The lifeboat was gone. This was the single most significant absence among everything the boarding party noted. The Mary Celeste carried a lifeboat on the main hatch, a small open boat that was the crew's means of moving between ship and shore or ship and ship in circumstances that did not permit the larger vessel to approach. The davits, the curved arms of wood and metal from which the lifeboat had been suspended, were still in place. But the boat itself was gone, not washed away in the manner of a sudden wave or a waterspout, not broken off in a storm, removed, deliberately, swung out from the davits and launched. The main hatch below the davits showed scratches and marks consistent with the boat having been dragged across it in the process of launching. There was no blood. Deveau searched the ship for any sign of violence and found none. No blood on the deck or the cabins or the rigging. No signs of struggle. No broken furniture or fittings that suggested a fight. No weapons that had been used in the recent past in any way that left a mark. A sword was found in the captain's cabin, an old-fashioned weapon, and it appeared to have a reddish-brown stain on the blade, a stain that the Queen's advocate in Gibraltar would later seize upon as potential evidence of violence. But chemical analysis, conducted at the time, found no evidence that the stain was blood. It was rust, or possibly some other organic material, but not blood. There was no blood anywhere on the Mary Celeste. The captain's cabin told a story of interrupted domesticity. Benjamin Briggs had sailed with his wife Sarah and their daughter Sophia, and the cabin reflected this: a family space, not just a working captain's quarters. Sarah's belongings were there: her sewing kit, a small melodeon, a case for her harmonium, books, the domestic equipment of a woman making a cabin into something resembling home over a long ocean crossing. A child's toy was in the cabin. A pair of the captain's boots were there. His pipes, his charts. What was not there was the sextant, the chronometer, and the ship's register. The sextant and the chronometer are the essential tools of celestial navigation, the instruments by which a captain locates his ship on the featureless surface of the ocean by measuring the angle of the sun or the stars above the horizon. A captain who was abandoning his ship, even in a hurry, even in fear, would take these instruments with him, because without them, in an open boat on the ocean, navigation is impossible and survival unlikely. Their absence suggested that the departure from the ship, whatever its cause, had been orderly enough that someone had thought to collect them. The ship's register, the document that established the vessel's identity and ownership, was also gone. Again, an orderly departure. Someone had taken the papers that mattered, the documents you would need if you were planning to arrive somewhere and explain who you were and where you had come from. The last entry in the captain's log was dated November 24th, 1872, 8 in the morning. The position recorded was 37 degrees 1 minute north latitude, 25 degrees 1 minute west longitude, which is a position near the island of Santa Maria in the Azores, at the eastern edge of that Atlantic archipelago. The Mary Celeste was found on December 4th, approximately 10 days later, considerably further east and north. Someone had sailed the ship, or the ship had sailed herself, from the Azores toward the Strait of Gibraltar over those 10 days, which meant the ship had been without her crew for at least that long, possibly longer. There was food aboard, 6 months' worth of provisions, by DeVoe's estimate, fresh water in the barrels, enough for the voyage many times over. There was no shortage of food or water that would have driven the crew to abandon ship out of desperation. Whatever had caused the evacuation, hunger and thirst, had no part in it. The cargo was in the hold, 1,701 barrels of commercial alcohol consigned to a shipper in Genoa, substantially intact. When the ship was examined more closely in Gibraltar, 9 of those barrels were found to be empty, or nearly so. 9 barrels out of 1,701, all of them made of red oak rather than white oak, all of them dry or nearly dry, where their white oak counterparts were full. The significance of those 9 barrels, and the specific reason they were made of red oak rather than white oak, would become central to the most scientifically credible explanation for what happened to the Mary Celeste. The ship that Oliver DeVoe and his 2 companions found drifting in the Atlantic on December 4th, 1872, was a sound vessel in working condition that had been vacated rapidly, but not in a complete panic, by people who had taken their essential navigational instruments and their official papers, but left everything else behind, including 6 months of food and water and a cargo worth tens of thousands of dollars, and all the personal belongings that tell the story of a family and a crew going about the ordinary business of a transatlantic voyage. This is the mystery, not the dramatic wreck of romantic fiction, not a ship with signs of violence or disaster, but a vessel that should have had people on it and did not, that had been living and working and had suddenly stopped, like a clock that runs and then does not, with no visible mechanism of failure. The Mary Celeste had a history before she became famous for her absence of people. She was built in 1861 at Spencer's Island, Nova Scotia, constructed of local timber in the specific tradition of the Nova Scotia shipbuilding industry that was, in the mid-19th century, producing a significant fraction of the sailing ships that operated the transatlantic and international trade routes. She was a brigantine, a 2-masted vessel with a specific sail configuration that made her reasonably agile and suitable for ocean crossing with a relatively small crew, and she was launched under the name Amazon. The Amazon was not a fortunate ship. Her first captain died within days of her registration. On her maiden voyage, she struck a fishing weir in the Bay of Fundy and suffered damage. She was subsequently involved in a collision in the English Channel with another vessel, the collision leaving the other ship sunk and the Amazon's bow damaged. A succession of accidents and misfortunes followed over the next several years, and the ship developed, fairly or unfairly, the reputation of an unlucky vessel, the kind of ship that sailors spoke of in the specific way that maritime superstition uses, a ship that attracts trouble. She was eventually wrecked on Cape Breton Island, refloated and repaired by American interests, and sold. In 1869, she was purchased by a consortium of American investors that included James Winchester of New York, who became the majority owner, and Benjamin Spooner Briggs of Marion, Massachusetts, who took a smaller share of ownership and accepted the command. At the time of her purchase, the ship was renamed. She became the Mary Celeste, a name that sounds like it should have a specific meaning, but whose origin is now uncertain. The renaming was not unlucky in any immediate sense. Under Winchester and Briggs, the ship made several successful voyages, carrying cargo across the Atlantic in the routine commerce of the American merchant marine, and whatever residual ill fortune attached to her previous name was not obviously operating in her first years as the Mary Celeste. She was a working ship, earning her keep, unremarkable in the way that successful commercial vessels in the 1870s were unremarkable. Benjamin Briggs himself was the opposite of the mythologized tragic figures that maritime disasters sometimes produce. He was a practical, sober, deeply religious man from a seafaring family, born in 1835 in Wareham, Massachusetts, one of several brothers who went to sea in the tradition of a coastal New England community where maritime commerce was a dominant way of life. He had been at sea since his teens, had risen through the positions of mate and captain on various vessels, and by 1872 was experienced enough and well regarded enough to have command of a ship he partially owned, which was the position an ambitious mariner of the period aspired to. He did not drink. This is noted by everyone who wrote about him as a character trait that distinguished him from many of his contemporaries in the maritime profession, and that was relevant to several of the theories that subsequent investigators would construct about the Mary Celeste. He was not a man who would be drunk in charge of his ship. He was not a man whose judgment would be impaired by alcohol. He was not a man whose crew would be likely to mutiny against an intoxicated or abusive captain. The sobriety was not merely a personal preference. It was a professional fact, a feature of the man that everyone who knew him confirmed. He was 37 years old in 1872. He had a wife, Sarah Elizabeth, whom he had married in 1862, and 2 children, a son, Arthur, 7 years old, who was at school in Marion and would not be making the voyage, and a daughter, Sophia Matilda, 2 years old, who would be sailing with her parents on the Mary Celeste. The decision to bring Sarah and Sophia on the voyage was not unusual for the period. Captains' wives sometimes sailed with their husbands, particularly on vessels where the captain had ownership interest and where the voyage was expected to be a normal commercial crossing without particular danger. Sarah Briggs was no stranger to sea voyages. She had sailed with her husband before. The presence of a 2-year-old daughter added a domestic dimension to the crossing that subsequent interpreters have found poignant, but at the time it was simply a family decision, a captain taking his family along because the opportunity presented itself and the voyage seemed safe. A letter that Briggs wrote to his mother shortly before the Mary Celeste's departure from New York has been preserved and shows a man in good spirits, comfortable with his ship and his crew, looking forward to the voyage. He described the vessel as being in good shape. He mentioned the crew and seemed satisfied with the men who had been engaged. He asked after the family at home. There was nothing in the letter to suggest premonition or anxiety, nothing of the shadow that retrospect tends to cast over the last communications of people who are about to die. The Mary Celeste departed from Pier 50 on the East River in New York on November 7, 1872, bound for Genoa, Italy, with 1,701 barrels of commercial alcohol in her hold. The cargo was denatured ethyl alcohol, commonly used in the Italian wine industry for fortifying wines, made from a grain base and with a small quantity of other chemicals added to make it unsuitable for drinking. It was not the kind of cargo that sailors would be tempted to consume, though it would burn, and if it were to leak in quantity in an enclosed space, the vapor it produced would be both flammable and hazardous. The 11 members of the crew, plus Sarah and Sophia Briggs, brought the total number of people aboard to 13. The first mate was Albert Richardson, a capable and experienced officer. The second mate was Andrew Gilling. The cook and steward was Edward Head, recently married, described as a reliable and sober man. The 4 seamen were Germans, Volkert and Arian Martens, brothers, and Gottlieb Gutschad and Bos Lorentzen. The crew was small but adequate for a vessel of the Mary Celeste's size, and nothing in their records suggested trouble. The Dei Gratia had left New York approximately a week later, on November 15th, and she was now finding the Mary Celeste adrift at a position well past the Azores. In the 9 days between the last log entry and the discovery, The Mary Celeste had covered several hundred miles on her own, driven by whatever wind had found her sails, and given no navigation, drifting eastward toward the Strait of Gibraltar, as if following her route to Genoa on instinct rather than direction. The discovery and its aftermath set in motion a chain of events that began with the practical and ended with the suspicious. Deveau and his two companions sailed the Mary Celeste to Gibraltar over the following days, a challenging feat with only 3 men to manage 2 ships, and arrived on December 13th. The Dei Gratia arrived shortly after. Captain Morehouse reported the find to the proper authorities, and what followed was an investigation that managed, in the specific manner of official inquiries into matters they cannot explain, to be simultaneously thorough and inconclusive. The Queen's advocate at Gibraltar was a man named Solly Flood, and Flood approached the Mary Celeste case with the conviction, stated explicitly and early, that something criminal had occurred. He did not know what. He had no evidence of what. But the sight of an abandoned ship, with an intact cargo, and the absence of the crew and any obvious cause, struck Flood as more consistent with foul play than with accident, and he pursued the investigation with the prosecutorial zeal of a man who has decided on a conclusion and is looking for the evidence to support it. He ordered a thorough examination of the ship. He had the cargo checked, the hold inspected, the hull examined below the waterline, the rigging assessed. He had a medical officer examine the ship for any signs of violence. He had the reddish stain on the sword tested for blood. He commissioned a detailed survey of the hull, which found the ship sound. He examined the marks on the bow, which appeared to be cut marks of some kind, marks that he interpreted as evidence of an attack, and that subsequent investigators would interpret as normal wear or as evidence of an entirely different theory. The cut marks on the bow were 2 shallow cuts in the wood of the bow railing, symmetrical on either side of the bow, running along the length of the rail for a foot or more. Flood believed they were axe marks, evidence that the ship had been boarded and attacked. Others believed they were the marks left by some natural event, rocks or debris in the water scraping against the hull, or simply the wear of a vessel that had been in service for some time. They were examined and re-examined and argued about, and the arguments were never settled. Flood's main suspicion, the theory that his investigation seemed designed to establish, was that the crew of the Dei Gratia had killed the people on the Mary Celeste and staged the abandonment to collect the salvage. He had a circumstantial case of sorts. Morehouse and Briggs knew each other. Morehouse had been in New York at the same time as Briggs. The Dei Gratia had left a week after the Mary Celeste and had then found her abandoned on the ocean. The timing could, if you were inclined toward suspicion, be made to look like the Dei Gratia had planned to intercept the Mary Celeste and had done so. The theory did not hold up to scrutiny in any of its specific predictions. There was no blood on the Mary Celeste, despite Flood's certainty that there had been violence. The Dei Gratia's crew would have needed to sail their own vessel while simultaneously sailing the abandoned Mary Celeste, which was done with only 3 men and considerable difficulty. There was no motive established. The salvage award was worth far less than the cargo and ship combined, and Morehouse would have gained much more by simply continuing with his own commercial voyage. The cut marks on the bow looked nothing like the results of an axe attack when examined by people who were not already convinced of their significance. And the general character of Morehouse and his crew, their professional reputations and their behavior throughout the investigation, was inconsistent with the proposition that they had committed multiple murders and then calmly sailed into Gibraltar to report their find. Flood pressed his case nonetheless, with the particular energy of a man who has public responsibility for a disturbing event and cannot accept that the disturbing event might not have a human villain. The Gibraltar court eventually settled the matter with the salvage award of £1,700, a significantly lower amount than the normal percentage of the ship's value and cargo would have provided, suggesting that the court was not entirely persuaded of the innocence of the salvors without being willing to accuse them of anything specific. It was a verdict of official uncertainty, the court's way of saying that it did not know what had happened and was not sure the people before it were telling the whole truth, without being willing to say that they were lying. The Briggs family, when the news reached New England, was quietly devastated. James Winchester, the majority owner of the Mary Celeste, was apparently genuinely distressed. No one among the people who knew the principals in the case expressed anything other than bewilderment. There was no pattern of behavior that suggested criminal conspiracy, no unusual financial arrangements that pointed toward fraud, no whispered knowledge that eventually surfaced in the way that well-kept secrets rarely do when money is involved and the consequences of discovery are sufficiently serious. In the years after the Gibraltar hearing, the theories accumulated in the manner of theories about unsolvable mysteries, each one filling some of the evidentiary gaps while creating others, each one finding adherents who took it seriously and critics who found it wanting. Piracy was the simplest theory. Piracy had attacked the Mary Celeste, killed or abducted the crew, and for reasons that no one could explain, left the cargo untouched. The problem with piracy was the cargo. 1,701 barrels of commercial alcohol, even denatured alcohol, was valuable cargo, and pirates who had gone to the trouble of taking a ship and eliminating its crew would not normally leave the cargo behind. And the ship herself was valuable. A seaworthy brigantine in good condition was worth considerably more than any salvage payment. Pirates who had boarded the Mary Celeste would have sailed away on her, not abandoned her to drift across the Atlantic. There was also the absence of violence, no blood, no signs of struggle, no damage consistent with an attack. The insurance fraud theory, in various versions, never quite worked out. The cargo was insured, and the ship was insured, but a successful fraud would have required the cargo to be actually lost, which it was not. It arrived in Gibraltar intact. Captain Briggs had invested his own money in the ship, which is not the behavior of a man planning to defraud the insurance company. And Briggs' character, sober, religious, professionally scrupulous, was specifically inconsistent with the planning and execution of a maritime fraud that would require the destruction of a ship and the permanent disappearance of everyone on it. The ergot theory, proposed in various forms by various researchers, suggested that the crew had consumed bread made from grain contaminated by ergot, a fungus that can infect rye and other grains and that produces ergotamine, a compound with hallucinogenic and convulsive effects. Ergotism, historically known as St. Anthony's fire, has caused mass outbreaks of irrational behavior in populations that consumed contaminated grain, and it has been proposed as the explanation for various historical episodes of collective irrationality. The problem with applying this theory to the Mary Celeste is that the ship's provisions did not show any evidence of contamination, and the specific behavior associated with ergotism, the convulsions and hallucinations and burning sensations, is quite different from the apparently orderly evacuation that the physical evidence suggests. People suffering acute ergotism do not carefully collect the sextant and chronometer before abandoning ship. The waterspout theory proposed that a waterspout, a tornado over water, had alarmed the crew sufficiently to cause them to abandon ship. Waterspouts are real and can be alarming, but they are not, as a rule, sufficient cause to abandon a seaworthy vessel that is not in their direct path, and they do not explain why the crew would not have returned to the ship once the waterspout had passed. The rogue wave theory, in which an unusually large wave swept or nearly swept the deck, runs into similar difficulties. A wave large enough to cause alarm would likely have left evidence on the ship, and the subsequent calm would have made return to the ship the obvious response. The seaquake theory proposed that an underwater earthquake had shaken the ship so violently that the crew, unable to understand what was happening and fearing the ship was about to sink, evacuated in panic. Underwater earthquakes do occur in the relevant area of the Atlantic, and a seaquake strong enough to shake a ship would indeed be frightening, particularly to people who had no concept of submarine geology as an explanation for what they were experiencing. The theory has the advantage of explaining a sudden, terrifying event with no visible cause and no lasting physical damage to the ship. Its weakness is the absence of evidence. There is no record of a significant seismic event in the area at the relevant time, and the seaquake theory requires a specific geological coincidence that cannot be verified. The vapor explosion theory is the one that has attracted the most serious scientific attention, and it is the one that fits the most pieces of the physical evidence into a coherent account. It begins with the 9 missing barrels. When the Mary Celeste's cargo was examined in Gibraltar, 9 barrels were found to be empty or nearly empty. 1,701 barrels of commercial alcohol, and 9 of them dry. These 9 barrels were made of red oak rather than white oak, and this distinction is not a minor technical detail, but a fundamental material property with significant consequences for what those barrels could do. Red oak and white oak are superficially similar materials, both strong and durable, both historically used for barrel construction. But red oak has an internal structure that white oak does not. Open pores, connected channels that run through the wood, and that make red oak significantly more permeable than white oak. White oak, by contrast, has a closed pore structure, with cells that are plugged by natural deposits called tyloses, making white oak almost impermeable to liquids. This is why white oak has been the preferred wood for wine and spirits barrels for centuries. The wine stays in, the wood stays dry, the flavors develop in a controlled way. Red oak leaks. 9 red oak barrels, filled with denatured industrial alcohol, sealed in the hold of the Mary Celeste. As the ship crossed the Atlantic in November of 1872, those 9 barrels were slowly leaking, their contents seeping through the porous wood and evaporating into the air of the sealed hold. Alcohol vapor is heavier than air, and would have settled and accumulated in the lowest spaces of the hold, building up over days and weeks to a concentration that was, potentially, explosive. The hold of the Mary Celeste, when it was opened in Gibraltar, did not smell of alcohol. This is the detail that supports the theory. The absence of alcohol smell when the hold was opened, after the ship had been at sea without anyone managing the cargo, suggests that whatever vapor had accumulated had already escaped. The non-smell of a hold that should, if the alcohol were sealed and intact, have smelled strongly of its cargo, indicates that the hold had been opened and ventilated at some point before the Gibraltar examination. The theory, developed and refined by various researchers over the decades, proposes the following sequence of events. At some point shortly after November 24, 1872, the date of the last log entry, Captain Briggs, or a member of the crew, detected the smell of alcohol vapor in the hold, or perhaps noticed that the ship was riding higher in the water than expected, which might indicate that liquid was missing from the barrels. Either event would have prompted an examination of the hold. The hatch was opened. The moment the hatch was opened, the accumulated vapor found an escape route. Not explosively in the traditional sense, but in a pressure burst, a sudden rush of vapor out through the hatch, possibly accompanied by a small ignition event, a flash without flames, a noise without lasting fire. The physical evidence from this event, if it happened as the theory describes, would have been minimal. No damage to the hatch or the hold, no scorch marks, no fire damage, perhaps a smell and a sound and a sudden blast of air through the hatch. To the crew of the Mary Celeste, this event, whatever it looked and sounded like, would have been terrifying. They were sailing with 1,700 barrels of alcohol in the hold. They had just experienced what seemed to be evidence that the cargo was volatile and potentially explosive. The logical fear was that this small event was the prelude to a catastrophic one, that the hold was a bomb waiting to go off, and that the only reasonable response was to get away from the ship as quickly as possible. The scientific support for this version of the theory comes from an experiment conducted by Andrea Sella, a professor of chemistry at University College London, who in 2006 demonstrated that a controlled release of butane gas could produce exactly this kind of non-destructive pressure burst, a detonation that makes a noise and creates a sudden pressure event without leaving any lasting damage. Using a wooden box with a transparent panel and a metered quantity of gas, Sella showed that the right concentration of flammable gas, ignited by a small spark, produced a flash and a pressure wave that pushed open the box without damaging it. The gas was gone. To anyone who had experienced this event without understanding the chemistry, it would have seemed both explosive and catastrophic. The crew of the Mary Celeste had just experienced something very much like Sella's experiment. They were not chemists. They did not know about the porosity of red oak versus white oak, or the specific flammability characteristics of alcohol vapor at various concentrations. They knew they had heard, or felt, or seen something that suggested the cargo might be about to explode, and they made the decision that any reasonable, frightened people would make. They left. The evacuation was orderly. Someone took the sextant and the chronometer, the essential navigation instruments. Someone took the ship's papers. They launched the lifeboat from the main hatch and got into it. Someone, in the haste of departure, attached a line from the lifeboat to the ship, possibly intending to stay close to the Mary Celeste and return when it became clear that the expected explosion was not going to happen. And then the wind caught the Mary Celeste's sails. The specific wind conditions in the Atlantic in November, in the area of the Azores and to the east, can be strong and variable. A ship, with even partial sail set, can make several knots in a moderate wind. A lifeboat, loaded with 10 people and rowed by exhausted sailors, might make 1 or 2 knots at most. The gap between the ship and the lifeboat, once the ship began to move under wind power, would have opened rapidly. The tow line, if it had been attached, would have tightened and then either parted under the load or been released as the lifeboat was dragged along or overturned. The Mary Celeste sailed away from the people who had just abandoned her, moving faster than they could follow, disappearing over the horizon while they pulled on the oars and watched her go. A small boat in the open Atlantic in late November with 10 people aboard and the essential navigation instruments, but limited provisions and no shelter from the weather. The chances of survival in those conditions, for that period, with the technology available to the crew of the Mary Celeste, were effectively zero. North Atlantic in winter is not a place where open boats survive. The prevailing winds and currents in that area would have pushed the lifeboat generally to the south and east, toward the African coast and the Canary Islands, but the distances were enormous and the weather was not on their side. No trace of the lifeboat was ever found. No bodies, no wreckage. No message in a bottle, nothing of the 10 people who left the Mary Celeste was ever recovered. They vanished into the Atlantic as completely as if they had never existed, leaving only the evidence of their departure on the ship they left behind. The famous detail that is not true is the breakfast. For most of the 150 years since the discovery of the Mary Celeste, popular accounts of the mystery have described the boarding party finding a meal still on the table, cups of coffee still warm, food half-eaten, the image of a crew interrupted in the middle of a meal by whatever sudden catastrophe drove them from the ship. This detail appears in virtually every popular account. It comes directly from a short story. In 1884, Arthur Conan Doyle, who had not yet published the first Sherlock Holmes story, and was a young doctor writing fiction to supplement his medical income, published a story in Cornhill magazine called J. Habakkuk Jeffson's Statement. The story was a fictional account of the Mary Celeste, thinly disguised as a narrative of an eyewitness survivor. It was well written and compelling, and it introduced numerous details that were entirely invented, including the half-eaten breakfast, the name that Conan Doyle used for the ship, Mary Celeste, which is incorrect but became widely used, and various dramatic explanations for the crew's fate that had no relationship to the actual evidence. The story was so convincing that many readers took it for a factual account, and several of the fictional details migrated into the public understanding of the real case, and have remained there ever since. The breakfast that was never there, the warm coffee that was never warm, the meal that was never interrupted, the Sir Conan Doyle's inventions, given such durability by the quality of his prose that they outlasted the real evidence and became the facts most people know about the Mary Celeste. The actual physical evidence of what was found on the ship is both less dramatic and more interesting than the fictional version. No interrupted meals, but a sextant and chronometer missing. No blood-soaked deck, but 9 empty red oak barrels in the hold. No dead captain at the helm, but a compass, displaced from its binnacle, and a rope trailing from the stern. The real mystery is quieter than the fictional one, and its most likely explanation is simultaneously convincing and definitively unprovable. The Gibraltar hearing eventually released the Mary Celeste to her owners after several months of investigation and argument. James Winchester came to Gibraltar personally to oversee the return of the ship, and she was repaired and returned to service. The investigation into what had happened was formally inconclusive. No charges were brought against anyone. No explanation was adopted as official, and the case was closed without resolution. The Mary Celeste continued to sail. She had been famous for a moment, the subject of an international maritime investigation, the object of profound public curiosity, and then she was returned to the ordinary business of carrying cargo across oceans, which is what she had been built to do. Over the following 12 years, she passed through the hands of a succession of owners and captains, none of whom found anything remarkable about her or reported any unusual events aboard. She was a working ship, one of thousands, no longer the subject of news stories or official inquiries, just a brigantine making her way through the North Atlantic and the Caribbean and the Mediterranean on whatever routes her owners directed. In 1885, she was purchased by a man named Gilman Parker, who developed the specific ambition that a ship with an interesting history is sometimes vulnerable to, the ambition of making more from her destruction than from her operation. Parker overinsured the Mary Celeste and her cargo, and then, on January 3, 1885, deliberately ran her onto a reef on the coast of Haiti near Cap Haitien. The grounding was too obvious to be accidental. The reef was well charted, the weather was clear, the conditions were nothing that would have driven a vessel onto a reef without intent. An investigation was conducted, and Parker and his associates were charged with piracy, the deliberate destruction of a vessel for insurance purposes. Parker died before the trial concluded. The charges against his associates were eventually dropped. The insurance fraud that ended the Mary Celeste's career was never prosecuted to conviction. In the specific tradition of the ship's history, The answers that the evidence seemed to point toward were never confirmed. The conclusions that seemed obvious could never be proven, and justice and explanation both remained elusive. The wreck of the Mary Celeste on the Haitian Reef was the final chapter in a story that had begun in Nova Scotia in 1861 with the launching of a ship called the Amazon, and had passed through the accident of a name and an abandonment in the Atlantic and an investigation in Gibraltar and 12 years of ordinary commercial service to end with deliberate destruction in shallow Caribbean water. The ship's hull was left on the reef, too damaged to be worth salvaging, and she gradually deteriorated in the tropical environment until nothing identifiable remained. In 2001, an expedition led by the underwater explorer Clive Cussler identified what was believed to be the remains of the Mary Celeste on the Haitian Reef, finding hull fragments and other material consistent with the ship's construction. The identification was not universally accepted, and subsequent examination of the site has not produced the kind of definitive physical evidence that would confirm beyond doubt which ship lies in those Haitian waters. The Mary Celeste, even in death, declines to give clear answers. The mystery of the Mary Celeste is, at its core, the mystery of 10 people who made a decision. They were on a seaworthy ship, well provisioned, carrying a valuable cargo, doing what they had been engaged to do, sailing from New York to Genoa. Something happened on or about November 24 or 25, 1872, between Santa Maria Island and the spot where the Dei Gratia found the ship 10 days later, something that convinced every single person on the Mary Celeste that they needed to get off immediately. And they got off, and the ship sailed away without them, and they were never seen again. The vapor explosion theory fits the evidence better than any other, the 9 empty red oak barrels providing the mechanism, the pressure burst through the hatch providing the frightening event, the orderly evacuation with the navigation instruments providing the evidence of rational response to fear, the trailing rope providing the evidence of the tow connection, the wind providing the force that separated the ship from the lifeboat. The theory is coherent. It accounts for the physical evidence. It involves no implausible coincidences or improbable conspiracies. It explains what was found and what was not found on the Mary Celeste without requiring fraud or violence or supernatural intervention. And it cannot be proven. The people who experienced it are gone. The lifeboat that carried them is gone. The specific event that frightened them is not recorded anywhere by anyone who was there to see it. The theory explains the mystery with a satisfying completeness that cannot, after 150 years, be confirmed by any witness or any surviving evidence that goes beyond what was already found on the ship in December of 1872. The most haunting dimension of the vapor theory is the possibility it raises about the cargo that was left behind. If the 9 red oak barrels had already leaked by the time of the pressure event, if the vapor that accumulated had already largely escaped, if the flash or pressure burst that terrified the crew was the last gasp of a danger that had already spent itself, then the Mary Celeste, after the evacuation, was, in a specific and terrible irony, no longer dangerous. The vapor had gone. The risk had passed. The hold was just a hold, with 1,700 barrels of mostly intact commercial alcohol that would arrive safely in Gibraltar weeks later. The 10 people in the lifeboat abandoned a ship that was no longer dangerous, out of fear of something that had already ceased to threaten them. They gave their lives to escape a danger that was already over. They rowed away from safety and died in the open ocean because they were afraid of something that was, in the end, not going to kill them. This is the haunting fact at the center of the Mary Celeste mystery. Not conspiracy, not violence, not supernatural disappearance. A chemical process in 9 porous barrels, an accumulated vapor, a pressure event that was frightening but not fatal, and 10 people who made a rational decision based on the information available to them and were killed by the consequences of that decision. Benjamin Briggs had survived years at sea, had built a reputation as a careful and prudent captain, had brought his wife and daughter on this voyage because he considered it safe. He was not a reckless man. He was not a negligent man. Whatever he saw or heard or felt on that morning in the Atlantic near the Azores, it was enough to convince a careful, experienced, sober man that the ship was about to explode, and he made the decision that his responsibility to his crew and his family demanded: get everyone off, get everyone away from the danger, deal with the consequences later, when they were safe. Later never came. The wind had other plans for the Mary Celeste. The ship sailed on to Gibraltar under no one's command, carrying the evidence of its own abandonment in the 9 empty barrels and the trailing rope and the missing lifeboat and the absent people. She arrived in Gibraltar and was found to be seaworthy, and her cargo substantially intact, and the investigation that followed could not explain what the ship itself could not explain: where the people had gone, and why. They were in the Atlantic. They were in an open boat. They were rowing against a wind that was carrying their ship faster than they could follow, watching the Mary Celeste grow smaller on the horizon, watching the gap widen that they could not close, until the ship was out of sight, and they were alone in the open ocean with 2 oars and a sextant and whatever food and water they had been able to grab in the minutes between the decision to abandon ship and the moment the lifeboat hit the water. They were never found. The Atlantic is very large, and a lifeboat is very small, and the winter weather in the North Atlantic in late November and December is not kind. Whatever became of them, it became quickly, within days or perhaps within hours of the abandonment, before anyone who might have looked for them knew they were missing, before the Dei Gratia found the drifting Mary Celeste, and anyone understood that there were people out there who needed to be found. The Mary Celeste sailed for 12 more years under various captains and was eventually wrecked in Haiti as part of an insurance fraud that was never prosecuted to conviction. The people who abandoned her were never found. And the most likely explanation for everything, the one that fits the evidence and requires no conspiracy and no improbable coincidence, the one that involves a chemical process and a pressure event and a decision made in fear on a November morning in the Atlantic, is permanently and definitively unprovable. This is what the mystery of the Mary Celeste amounts to. After 150 years of investigation and theory, a ship in very good condition, carrying a valuable intact cargo, found without its people in the middle of the ocean, and the best explanation we have for why the people left is that they were scared of a danger that had already passed. They left a safe ship for an open boat and died there. The ship arrived in Gibraltar without them and was pronounced seaworthy. The lifeboat was never found. The compass that was in the binnacle when Oliver Deveau boarded the Mary Celeste had been sailing the ship without anyone to use it for 10 days. It pointed north, as compasses do, indifferent to the absence of the hands that should have been reading it, indifferent to the absence of the people whose lives depended on knowing where north was and what to do about it. The compass knew nothing about what had happened. It was doing what it was built to do. It is the appropriate image for the Mary Celeste. Instruments functioning correctly, ship moving correctly, everything in its proper state, and no one there to use any of it. The people are in the Atlantic. They have been in the Atlantic for 150 years. The Mary Celeste found her own way to Gibraltar without them, and the Gibraltar court tried and failed to understand what the evidence in front of it meant, and the ship sailed for 12 more years and was wrecked and rotted on a Haitian reef, and the years accumulated, and the theories accumulated, and the facts remained what they were when Oliver Deveau climbed over the rail in December of 1872 and looked around at an empty ship, seaworthy, provisioned, cargo intact, 9 barrels empty. The sea has not given them back. It keeps what it takes, and it took them completely, thoroughly, without leaving a trace that would confirm or deny any of the theories that 150 years of trying to understand them has produced. The mystery is real. The explanation is probable. The certainty is impossible. And the Mary Celeste, the unlucky ship with the forgotten name and the famous abandonment, is on the bottom of the Caribbean near Haiti, too broken and too altered by time to tell us anything that her absence of people has not already told us. They were afraid. They left. The wind took the ship. The ocean took them, and everything else is theory. The specific texture of the mystery, the quality that makes it distinct from other maritime disappearances, is the seaworthiness of the ship that was left behind. Ships disappear with all hands for known reasons: storms, fires, structural failures, collisions. The evidence of the disaster is usually present in the wreckage, in the condition of what is found, in the physical record of what went wrong. The Mary Celeste presented none of this. She was found in a condition that suggested nothing had gone wrong with the ship. The ship was fine. The ship was more than fine. She was sailing. She was making progress through the ocean in the direction of her destination, doing exactly what she had been sent to do, moving through the water with the competence of a vessel that had been well maintained and properly prepared for her voyage. The absence of people from a ship this seaworthy is what distinguishes the Mary Celeste from other famous maritime mysteries. It is not the mystery of a ship that failed, of a vessel that succumbed to the forces that the ocean brings to bear on wooden hulls and canvas sails and the various systems that keep a ship alive and moving. It is the mystery of a ship that succeeded, that did what it was built to do, and found itself doing it without the people who were supposed to be doing it with her. This distinction matters for understanding the theories, because it eliminates every explanation that involves the ship being too damaged or too dangerous for the crew to remain. A ship that sinks takes its people with it, or leaves them in the water. A ship on fire takes its people or leaves them fleeing. The Mary Celeste did neither. She was in the water, moving through it, structurally sound, her cargo intact, her provisions abundant. Whatever the crew was afraid of was not the ship itself. The captain's melodeon, which his wife Sarah had brought along to make the captain's cabin feel more like home during the long Atlantic crossing, was there. It is a detail that appears in various accounts of the case with a specific emotional weight, because a musical instrument in a ship's cabin is a detail of domestic normalcy, a thing that people bring not for practical purposes, but for the quality of life it provides on a long voyage away from home. Sarah Briggs played the melodeon. She had brought it from Marion, Massachusetts, across the gangway of the Mary Celeste in New York Harbor, and it had sat in the captain's cabin for the weeks of the voyage, and it was still there when Oliver Deveau opened the cabin door. Whatever had caused the evacuation had not given anyone time or motivation to bring the melodeon. The 2-year-old's clothing was in the cabin. Sophia Matilda Briggs, who was at the age where children accumulate more clothing than they can possibly wear because they soil and tear it faster than adults anticipate, had her small garments in the cabin. A child's cap, small items of clothing that would be purchased in coastal Massachusetts and packed for a voyage to the Mediterranean in the autumn of 1872 by a mother who was thinking about her daughter's comfort on the crossing. Benjamin Briggs had written to his mother in the days before departure from New York, and the letter was preserved, and it gives the specific impression of a man looking forward to a voyage rather than dreading one. He mentioned the ship being in good condition. He mentioned the crew and seemed satisfied with them. He mentioned Sarah and Sophia and his plans for the voyage. The tone of the letter was the tone of a confident professional beginning a job that he expected to do well, with his family beside him, and his investment in the vessel giving him an additional stake in the success of the crossing. He was a religious man. This is mentioned by everyone who knew him, and it is not irrelevant to the specific texture of the mystery, because a deeply religious man in command of a ship in the 1870s would have a specific relationship to the concept of running from danger. The maritime tradition of the time was not one of easy surrender to fear. Captains were expected to stay with their ships through difficulties, to command through adversity, to be the last to leave a vessel in distress. Benjamin Briggs had not left a ship in distress. He had left a ship that he believed was about to become dangerous, which is a different thing, and the distinction matters for the evaluation of the vapor theory. A man who would stay at his post through normal maritime danger would need to see something genuinely extraordinary before he would order his wife and daughter into a lifeboat. A pressure burst from an accumulation of alcohol vapor in the hold of a ship carrying nearly 2,000 barrels of alcohol would have been genuinely extraordinary to a captain of the 1870s. Briggs would not have had a chemist's understanding of what had happened. He would have known that something had exploded, or partially exploded, from the hold where the cargo was stored. He would have known that the cargo was alcohol, and that alcohol burned. He would have reasoned from the evidence in front of him to the most alarming available interpretation. The cargo was unstable, the hold was potentially explosive, and he had his wife and his daughter on the ship. A man who would stay at his post through storms and mechanical difficulties would leave his ship if he believed that staying meant sitting on top of an explosive cargo with his family. The order to abandon ship was not an act of cowardice or of panic without foundation. It was a rational response to evidence that, interpreted through the lens of available knowledge, indicated an imminent danger to everyone aboard. The vapor theory does not require Briggs to have been wrong about the risk. It requires only that he was working with incomplete information, that the true nature of what had happened was not accessible to him in the minutes after the hatch event, and that the rational inference from what he could observe led him to a conclusion that was more alarming than the actual situation warranted. The weather in the relevant area of the Atlantic in late November 1872 was, based on the meteorological records and the ship's log, variable, with periods of rough weather and calmer intervals. The Mary Celeste had apparently encountered heavy weather at some point in the voyage, which was responsible for the missing foresail and upper foretopsail. The rough weather would have had specific effects on the cargo in the hold. The barrels would have shifted and settled, the liquid would have moved in the barrels, and the seams and joints of the red oak barrels, already more porous than their white oak counterparts, would have been stressed by the movement. The combination of the voyage's rough weather and the inherent porosity of the red oak staves would have accelerated the leakage from those 9 barrels, and the vapor accumulation in the hold would have been proceeding from the moment the Mary Celeste's cargo was sealed in at New York. 10 days of accumulated vapor in a sealed hold, with 9 barrels slowly emptying their contents into the air of the enclosed space, would have created a concentration well above the flammability threshold for alcohol vapor in air. The minimum flammability concentration for ethanol vapor in air is approximately 3.3% by volume. The maximum is approximately 19%. Within this range, a spark or an open flame would ignite the mixture. Above this range, the mixture is too rich to burn. Below it, too lean. The specific concentration of vapor in the Mary Celeste's hold at the moment the hatch was opened is not knowable at this distance. But the 9 empty barrels and the 10 days of accumulation provide a reasonable basis for estimating that the concentration was well above the minimum flammability threshold and possibly within the explosive range. The opening of the hatch would have changed the dynamics of the system in two ways. It would have introduced air from outside, potentially reducing the vapor concentration, and it would have provided the ventilation pathway through which the accumulated vapor could escape rapidly. If a spark existed, from the hatch hardware or from any other source at the moment of opening, the flashpoint would have been reached and an ignition event would have occurred. If no spark existed, the vapor would have simply rushed out through the hatch in a pressure burst, a sudden blast of alcohol-laden air pushing through the opening, which would itself have been alarming and disorienting to anyone standing near the hatch at the moment of opening. The experimental demonstration by Andrea Sella confirmed that this kind of event produces no lasting physical damage. The pressure burst is rapid, the energy is dissipated in the rush of gas through the opening, and the surfaces exposed to the event show no evidence of the event afterward. The hold would have smelled strongly of alcohol for a period after the event, and then, as the remaining vapor dispersed, the smell would have diminished. When the Dei Gratia's boarding party opened the hold in Gibraltar, the absence of any alcohol smell was noted. This is consistent with the vapor theory. The vapor that had accumulated over 10 days had escaped in the pressure event, and the remaining alcohol in the intact barrels was sealed and not producing significant additional vapor. The question of what the crew experienced in the moment of the event depends on where they were when it happened. If some of them were near the hatch when it was opened, they would have felt the blast and possibly seen the flash or smelled the rush of vapor. If the event was preceded by a detectable smell of alcohol vapor reaching the upper decks through whatever imperfect sealing existed around the hatch, then Briggs might have been investigating a problem he had already detected, going to the hatch with some awareness that something was wrong with the cargo. In either case, the pressure event would have been immediately alarming, particularly to anyone who understood that the hold contained nearly 2,000 barrels of alcohol. The decision to abandon ship would have followed quickly. There was no time for deliberation, and the specific orderliness of the departure, taking the sextant and chronometer, taking the ship's papers, suggests that the abandonment was not the immediate spontaneous panic of people running from a fire, but the rapid organized response of a captain who had assessed the situation, determined that the risk was too great to remain, and issued the orders that maritime training and professional discipline provided for exactly this situation. The lifeboat was on the main hatch. The main hatch was the hatch through which the cargo was loaded, the largest hatch on the ship, and the lifeboat that had been carried on top of it was a reasonably large vessel, a yawl or longboat, capable of carrying 10 people in relatively stable conditions. To launch it, the crew would have had to swing it out from the davits, lower it over the side or onto the water, and board it in some organized sequence. This takes time, and the fact that they took the time, rather than jumping directly into the water, is evidence of the orderliness of the departure. Someone attached a line from the lifeboat to the ship. The trailing rope that Deveau found behind the Mary Celeste was the rope from this line, the end that had been attached to the lifeboat having pulled free at some point during the days the ship sailed without the crew. The line had been fastened to the stern of the Mary Celeste, which means the lifeboat had been positioned at the stern, behind the ship, as the crew rowed or waited, maintaining the connection to the ship, while keeping some distance from the hold they feared might explode. And then the wind filled the sails. The Mary Celeste, with some sails still set from before the abandonment, caught the wind that was available in the late November Atlantic, and she began to move. Not dramatically, not with the speed of a racing yacht, but steadily and purposefully, as ships move when they are well built and carrying their proper ballast and given even partial sail in a moderate wind. The gap between the ship and the lifeboat opened. The line tightened, and then either the line broke, parted under the increasing load as the distance grew and the angle changed, or someone in the lifeboat cut it, because the ship was pulling them in a direction they could not control, and the alternative was to be dragged. When the line went, the Mary Celeste was free. She sailed. The lifeboat was left behind, 10 people watching the ship they had abandoned grow smaller in the distance, until it disappeared over the horizon, and they were alone. The Mediterranean, for which the Mary Celeste had been bound, was far to the east. The Azores, where the ship had been when the last log entry was made, were some distance behind. Nearest land in any practical direction was hundreds of miles away, in the open Atlantic in November, with rough weather, a constant possibility, and the sun already providing only a limited number of daylight hours for navigation. The sextant and chronometer would have allowed Briggs to know where they were. The ship's papers would have told him what ports and what currents and what winds he could expect in the region. He was not without resources, and he was a capable navigator who had spent his professional life at sea. But he was in an open boat with 9 other people, and no shelter, and no sail, and limited food and water, in one of the most challenging maritime environments in the world. The prevailing currents and winds in the Atlantic east of the Azores in November run generally to the southeast, toward the African coast. A lifeboat, drifting with the wind and current from a position near Santa Maria Island in the Azores, would have been carried in that direction over the days and weeks after the abandonment. The African coast, specifically the Canary Islands and the northwest African shore, was hundreds of miles away in that direction, a distance that would take weeks to cover in a lifeboat without sails, weeks during which the people in the boat would have needed food, water, shelter, and the kind of physical endurance that the late November Atlantic systematically degrades. No one on the coast of Africa or the Canary Islands reported finding 10 bodies or a lifeboat from the Mary Celeste. No one on any other coast reported finding them. No ship reported seeing them. The Atlantic, which gives back floating wreckage and occasionally bodies, gave back nothing from the Mary Celeste's lifeboat. The 10 people vanished as completely as they would have vanished had they simply walked off the edge of the world. This completeness of disappearance is itself information. Bodies in the Atlantic, carried by currents, have a tendency to appear somewhere eventually, if not immediately then, after enough time for the currents to bring them to a shore. The absence of any bodies from the Mary Celeste suggests either that the bodies were weighted down or otherwise prevented from floating, or that the deaths occurred far from any coastline and the bodies were dispersed by the action of the ocean before they could reach land, or that the deaths occurred in conditions that left no floating evidence. An open boat, swamped by a winter Atlantic storm, would leave its occupants in the water without life preservers in cold temperatures, and the rapid heat loss that cold water exposure produces would kill within hours, certainly within days. The bodies, in those conditions, might not float in the manner that encourages discovery. Or the storm itself, if it capsized the lifeboat or drove it under, might have left no surface evidence at all. The Atlantic has kept its secret about the 10 people from the Mary Celeste with a thoroughness that matches its indifference to their fate. The specific poignancy of the Mary Celeste mystery, the dimension of it that makes it more than just a maritime curiosity, is the presence of the child. Sophia Matilda Briggs was 2 years old. She was in the captain's cabin when the hatch event occurred, or nearby on the ship, tended by her mother or by the crew in the ordinary domestic arrangements of a ship, where a captain has brought his family. When the order to abandon ship was given, Sophia would have been picked up and carried to the lifeboat, wrapped in whatever was at hand against the cold of the November Atlantic, placed in the arms of her mother or her father or whoever was nearest when the boarding happened. She was in the lifeboat when it drifted away from the Mary Celeste. She was in the lifeboat for however long it lasted. A 2-year-old child on an open boat in the North Atlantic in late November is not a detail that history should pass over quickly. It is the specific human weight of the disaster, the individual face of what the vapor theory predicts as its final consequence. 10 people who left a safe ship for an unsafe lifeboat, and a 2-year-old among them. The Mary Celeste sailed on after them. She found Gibraltar, or something like it. The Dei Gratia crew guided her in, after managing 2 ships across the remaining distance with 3 men, and she was made fast in the harbor, and examined and argued over, and eventually released to her owners. The repairs that Winchester arranged in Gibraltar were sufficient to return her to service, and she went back to sea. 12 years of ordinary maritime life followed for the Mary Celeste. Under various captains and various owners, she sailed commercial routes, carried cargo, weathered storms, and arrived in ports from the Caribbean to the Mediterranean without particular incident. The famous case of her abandonment became a part of maritime history, referenced in legal proceedings and newspaper accounts, and eventually in fiction, but the ship herself was working, earning her keep, doing what ships do. Her reputation as an unlucky vessel persisted in sailor lore, and the captains who commanded her in those 12 years may have been aware of the reputation, but awareness did not stop them from accepting the command. Gilman Parker's decision to destroy her in 1885 was, as these things tend to be, motivated by financial calculation rather than superstition. The insurance fraud that Parker planned was not especially sophisticated. He overinsured the cargo, loaded a ship with a cargo of lesser value than the insurance suggested, and ran her onto a reef that was clearly visible and clearly charted. The reef near Cap Haitien in Haiti, where the Mary Celeste came to rest, was not a reef that a careful captain would have struck by accident. It was a reef that a careful captain would have known to avoid, and Parker's failure to avoid it was the kind of deliberate failure that the insurance companies and the courts recognized immediately. The investigation found enough evidence to charge Parker and his associates with barratry, the maritime crime of deliberately destroying a vessel. Parker died before the proceedings reached their conclusion, and the charges against the surviving associates were eventually abandoned. The insurance fraud, like the mystery of the abandonment 13 years earlier, ended without a definitive legal resolution. The hull of the Mary Celeste remained on the reef in Haiti, too damaged by the deliberate grounding and the subsequent breaking up to be salvaged, and it deteriorated in the Caribbean environment over the following years until nothing identifiable remained above or near the waterline. What is on the seabed near Cap Haitien that might be attributable to the Mary Celeste is not conclusively established, and the maritime archaeologists who have examined the area have not produced a definitive identification of the wreck. The ship is gone. The people are gone. The case is technically unsolved, in the sense that no court or investigation has ever produced a finding of established fact about what happened to the Mary Celeste's crew. The vapor theory is the most scientifically credible explanation, supported by the specific evidence of the 9 empty red oak barrels and the known chemistry of alcohol vapor in enclosed spaces and the experimental demonstration of non-destructive pressure bursts. But it remains a theory, an inference from physical evidence rather than a finding confirmed by any witness or any direct record of the event. The mystery has attracted, in the century and a half since the discovery, a remarkable quantity of attention from a remarkable variety of people: investigators, journalists, novelists, historians, mariners, chemists, lawyers, all of them drawn by the specific quality of the case, its completeness, its seaworthiness, its domestic details, the fact that everything except the people is still there, and the people are definitively gone. The theories that have been advanced range from the sensible to the extravagant, from the vapor theory's careful reasoning from physical evidence to proposals involving sea monsters and alien abduction that say more about the imaginative needs of the theorist than about the evidence from the ship. What the evidence actually shows, stripped of the fictional accretions and the imaginative embellishments, is simpler than most of the theories require. A ship in good condition, 9 empty barrels, a missing lifeboat, a trailing rope, missing navigation instruments, all the food and water still aboard. No blood, no violence, no note, no log entry after November 24. These are the facts. Everything else is inference. The inference that fits all of these facts without requiring any improbable additional elements is the vapor theory. The 9 empty barrels explain the vapor accumulation. The vapor accumulation explains the hatch event. The hatch event explains the abandonment. The orderly departure explains the missing instruments and papers. The trailing rope explains the attempt to maintain connection to the ship. The wind explains the separation. The open Atlantic in November explains the fate of the lifeboat. None of this is provable. None of it will ever be provable. The chemistry happened, or something like it, in the hold of the Mary Celeste on a day in late November 1872, and whatever happened was sufficient to drive 10 people off a seaworthy ship and into an open boat in the North Atlantic, and the North Atlantic did the rest. The Mary Celeste drifted for 10 days after they left her, driven by the same winds and currents that were pushing the lifeboat in the other direction, until the Dei Gratia found her and brought her in. The Dei Gratia's crew collected their modest salvage award and went back to sea. The Mary Celeste was repaired and went back to sea. The lifeboat and the 10 people in it were not found and were not going back anywhere. Oliver Deveau, who led the boarding party and gave the most detailed testimony about what was found on the ship, lived for decades after the discovery and told the story of the Mary Celeste to anyone who asked. He never wavered in his account of what he found. He never claimed to know what had happened. He said what a professional man says about a mystery, that he was given the evidence for, but not the explanation. He described what he saw. He noted what was absent. He reported it to the court, and he went back to his work. The compass that had been displaced from the binnacle when Deveau boarded was repaired and reinstalled. The Mary Celeste had her provisions restocked and her rigging put in order, and was declared seaworthy by the survey that Winchester arranged in Gibraltar. The 9 empty barrels were a 9-barrel gap in a cargo of 1,701, and they were noted in the survey and presumably accounted for in whatever settlement was reached with the consignee in Genoa. The ship that came into Gibraltar was the Mary Celeste. She was the same ship that had left New York on November 7th, physically intact, structurally sound, her cargo substantially complete. The people who had sailed her from New York to somewhere near Santa Maria Island were not with her. They are still in the Atlantic. They have been in the Atlantic since late November 1872. The ocean does not give them back. The most likely explanation for why they are in the Atlantic rather than in Genoa or Marion or wherever the voyage would eventually have taken them is that they were afraid of something that had already stopped being dangerous. Vapor had escaped. The pressure event was over. The hold was safe. The cargo was intact. The ship was sound. But they were in the lifeboat, watching the ship sail away from them, and the ship was not coming back, and the Atlantic was around them in every direction, and whatever they were afraid of on the ship no longer mattered. That is the haunting quality at the center of the Mary Celeste mystery, not the mystery itself, which is explicable, the end, which is inexorable. They left a safe ship in fear of a danger that had already passed, and the danger that was going to kill them was not in the hold at all. It was in the open water all around the lifeboat, in the cold and the waves and the distance from anywhere that could help them. Benjamin Briggs was a careful man. He made a careful decision based on the best information he had. The information was incomplete, and the decision killed him. His wife's melodeon is still in the captain's cabin of a ship that no longer exists. In the imagination of everyone who has heard the story of the Mary Celeste and wondered what the cabin looked like on the December afternoon when Oliver Deveau opened the door and found the room empty. The melodeon is what makes it real, not the navigation instruments, not the cargo records, not the legal proceedings in Gibraltar, but the small musical instrument that a woman brought on a sea voyage because the cabin where she would spend weeks crossing the Atlantic was going to be more bearable with music in it. Sarah Briggs played the melodeon. She brought it on the Mary Celeste. She left it in the cabin when the order came to go, because you do not carry a musical instrument when you are getting off a ship you believe is about to explode. And it stayed there, in the cabin, while the ship sailed herself to Gibraltar, one of the last quiet witnesses to the life that had been lived in that room before everything changed. The Atlantic has the rest. There is something specific about the maritime tradition that the Mary Celeste case illuminates, something about the relationship between sailors and their ships that goes beyond the practical and becomes something that has almost a theological dimension in the way that sailors of the 19th century understood it. A ship is not merely a vehicle. It is the thing between you and the ocean, the structure that keeps the water out and you in, the platform on which all of your work and all of your safety depends. The relationship between a captain and his ship is one of the most intense professional relationships available in that period, more intense in some respects than the relationship between a soldier and his regiment, because the soldier has comrades, but the captain has a vessel that is both companion and responsibility, the thing whose survival is inseparable from his own. Benjamin Briggs had invested money in the Mary Celeste. He had financial as well as professional interest in her safe arrival in Genoa. He had his family on her. Every dimension of his life was present on that ship. His professional reputation, his financial investment, his wife and daughter. And he left her. He left her because he believed he had to, because the evidence in front of him pointed to an imminent danger that made staying a choice he could not make with his family aboard. This is not a failure of character or of professional judgment. It is a decision made under conditions of extreme uncertainty with the most alarming available interpretation of the evidence. The vapor theory does not require Briggs to have been foolish or cowardly or wrong in any culpable way. It requires only that he was human, that he interpreted incomplete evidence in the most alarming available way, and that the consequence of his interpretation was fatal. The court at Gibraltar could not prove this. The court could not prove anything, which was the source of Solly Flood's frustration and the origin of the inadequate salvage award. The investigation produced a record of what was found on the ship and what was not found, and then it ran out of evidence and stopped. The mystery was left officially open, which it remains. The decades after the Gibraltar hearing saw the case pass from the domain of official investigation into the domain of popular mystery, where it has remained ever since. The story grew in the telling, accumulated fictional details and dramatic embellishments, was adopted by writers who found in it a template for the mystery story that needed only minor modification to serve any number of narrative purposes. The half-eaten breakfast, the warm cups of coffee, the sense of a crew interrupted in the middle of their ordinary lives. None of this is in the actual record, but all of it is in the popular understanding of the case, and it is more compelling than the actual evidence, which is the nature of fiction compared to reality. Arthur Conan Doyle's contribution to the confusion was significant but not unique. He was a writer who found a compelling real-world mystery and improved it for narrative purposes, which is what writers do. The improvement was so convincing that it merged with the real case in the public imagination, and the merged version, part fact and part fiction, is what most people know when they think of the Mary Celeste. This is unfortunate for historical accuracy, but entirely comprehensible as a cultural process. The real case is, in its actual details, more interesting than the fictional version, because the fictional version requires a dramatic and unexplained event, while the real case requires only a chemical process and a human decision. The chemical process is explicable. The human decision is understandable. And the outcome, the 10 people lost in the Atlantic while the ship sailed safely to Gibraltar, is more haunting than any invented mystery, because it is the outcome of a rational sequence of events, not of an inexplicable one. Rational actions with fatal consequences are more disturbing than irrational actions with fatal consequences. We can dismiss irrationality as aberrant. We cannot dismiss rationality in the same way, because rationality is what we rely on, and if rationality can lead to disaster, the ground beneath our confidence in reason becomes less stable. Benjamin Briggs made a reasonable decision, and it killed him. The decision was not obviously wrong given what he knew. It was not a failure of judgment that we can identify in retrospect and say, there, that is where he went wrong. That is the mistake. The mistake, if there was one, was in the information available to him rather than in the reasoning he applied to that information. The hold contained vapor. The hatch was opened. Something happened. The crew responded to what happened by leaving. The ship responded to the crew leaving by sailing away. The ocean responded to the lifeboat by taking it. Each step in the sequence follows from the previous one with a logic that, given the specific circumstances, is almost impossible to interrupt. The Mary Celeste case is a tragedy, in the technical dramatic sense, not a mystery. It is the working out of consequences that flow inevitably from a specific set of initial conditions, and the horror of it is not the inexplicability, but the explainability. Captain Morehouse, of the Dei Gratia, who had dined with Briggs in New York in October and who found the Mary Celeste drifting in the Atlantic in December, understood something of this. He had known Briggs as a careful and competent man, and when he looked at the evidence on the abandoned ship, the intact cargo, the food and water, the missing instruments and papers, he saw the evidence of a careful and competent man making a decision. He did not know what decision or what had prompted it, but the absence of violence and the presence of the instruments taken in evacuation told him that this was not an attack and not a panic. It was a choice. He reported the find to the Gibraltar authorities and accepted the investigation that followed, including the suspicions that Solly Flood directed at him and his crew, with the patience of a man who knows he is innocent and knows that the process of establishing innocence, when the guilty party cannot be identified, is unpleasant and prolonged. The salvage award that the court eventually paid was insultingly small by the standards of what the find was worth, but Morehouse accepted it and went back to sea. He never learned what had happened to the Mary Celeste's crew. No one did. The mystery was officially open when he died, and it is officially open now, 150 years later. The vapor theory is not official. It is not adopted by any authoritative body as the explanation. It is simply the best inference from the available evidence, the explanation that requires the fewest additional assumptions, and that accounts for the most elements of the physical record. The record itself is preserved in the testimony from the Gibraltar hearing, in the survey reports from the examination of the ship, in the correspondence of the parties involved, and in the logbooks that were found on the ship, and that ended with the entry for November 24. The record is partial and incomplete in the way that records of mysterious events are always incomplete. It describes what was found, but not what happened, what was absent, but not where the absent things went. The Mary Celeste became, in the popular imagination, a symbol of maritime mystery, the ship without a crew, the vessel that sailed itself across the Atlantic while its people were elsewhere and unreachable and eventually gone. The symbol has been useful to writers and filmmakers and to anyone who wants an example of maritime inexplicability, and the real case has been so thoroughly merged with the fictional versions that the two are nearly inseparable in most accounts. What the real case actually shows, stripped of the fiction and examined for what the evidence says, is something more interesting and more disturbing than any of the fictional versions. It shows a crew that made a rational decision. It shows an ocean that does not distinguish between people who deserve to die and people who do not, between decisions that are right and decisions that are wrong, between the careful and the careless. The ocean took the 10 people from the Mary Celeste and did not take note of their names or their characters or the specific quality of the decision that brought them to an open boat in the North Atlantic in November of 1872. The lifeboat was given to it, with the 10 people in it, by the sequence of events that began with 9 red oak barrels leaking into a sealed hold and ended with a ship sailing away from the people who had built their lives around it. The Mary Celeste sailed for 12 more years. The 10 people in the lifeboat did not. That is the mystery. Not where they went. They went into the Atlantic. Not what happened to the ship. The ship sailed on without them. The mystery is the gap between a seaworthy vessel, fully provisioned, sailing toward its destination, and the moment everything changed, the specific chain of events in the hold of the ship that produced the decision, and whether the decision was, in the final accounting, the one that a prudent man in those circumstances was obliged to make. It probably was. It killed them anyway, and the ship that they abandoned sailed itself to Gibraltar and was declared sound, and was repaired, and went back to sea, and carried cargo for 12 more years, until someone who had no use for her sailed her onto a reef in Haiti. The Melodeon is at the bottom of the Caribbean somewhere, or dissolved into whatever dissolution overtakes wooden instruments in tropical water. The compass that spun in the binnacle, while the Mary Celeste sailed herself east, is also gone. The 9 barrels of red oak, empty, are gone. The evidence is in the testimony of the Gibraltar hearing and in the accounts of the people who were there, and those accounts tell us what was found and not what happened, and the gap between those two things is the mystery that has lasted 150 years. It will last longer. The Atlantic does not give back what it takes, and the explanation that fits the evidence is not the kind of explanation that produces a confession or a survivor's account or any other document that would convert the probable into the certain. They were afraid of something that was no longer dangerous. They left. The ship sailed away. The rest is the ocean.